Everything you will hear in this video really happened. The events, locations, and crimes are real. Some parts may be dramatized, but their content is documented and verified. Some descriptions may be disturbing, as reality and death show no regard for sensitivities. Welcome to Hide the Evidence.
The grease-stained clock above the pizza warmer ticked past 4, marking the slow descent into another eerie evening. For Brian Wells, the hands of that clock measured out a life of quiet predictability, each tick a reminder of the miles driven, the pizzas delivered, the small, crumpled tips collected. At 46, his world had shrunk to the dimensions of his delivery car. The faint smell of pepperoni and dough clinging to his clothes, the static of the dispatch radio, a constant companion. He moved through the bustling kitchen of Mamma Mia's pizzeria with a weary familiarity, a man whose presence was noted more for its reliability than its vibrancy. His co-workers, loud and boisterous in their youth, exchanged jokes and playful shoves around him, their energy a stark contrast to his own subdued demeanor. Brian offered them a thin, tired smile, a gesture that never quite reached his eyes, before turning back to stack the warm cardboard boxes in his delivery bag. Outside, the late summer air was thick with humidity, the sky a bruised palette of orange and purple. He slid into the driver's seat of his beat-up sedan, the vinyl upholstery cracked and hot from the sun. A stack of delivery slips sat on the passenger seat, each one a tiny map to a different fragment of the city. He knew these streets intimately, every pothole and shortcut, the houses with the barking dogs and the apartments that never tipped. This knowledge was his only currency, a meager exchange for a life that was perpetually balanced on the edge of financial ruin. The weight of rent, utilities, and a car that was one repair away from the scrap yard was a constant, low hum of anxiety beneath the surface of his routine. It was this very vulnerability, this quiet desperation, that had led him to the fringes of a darker Erie. The acquaintances were not friends, just faces in dimly lit bars or voices on the phone, men who knew a guy who could get things. A small-time deal here, a simple delivery there, nothing major, just enough to close the gap when the tips were thin and the bills were thick. He thought of them only in passing, like the brief, sharp memory of a headache. They were a shadowy part of the landscape, a necessary compromise in the arithmetic of survival. He was a man easily overlooked, a figure in the background, and that very invisibility made him useful. As he pulled out of the parking lot, the neon sign of the pizzeria flickering in his rearview mirror, he had no premonition that the fragile ordinariness of his life was about to shatter. He was just a man driving into the dusk, thinking about the next delivery, the next turn, the next small, mundane task in a long, unbroken line of them. The order came in during the lull between the dinner rush and the late-night crowd, a stark, printed line on the dispatch slip that made Brian's stomach tighten with an instinctive unease. 2 large pepperoni pizzas, destined for an address on Peach Street, a location that sprawled far beyond the familiar grid of the city, out near the skeletal silhouette of the WHPTV transmission tower. He knew the area, a no-man's land of overgrown fields and abandoned industrial lots where the streetlights gave way to an oppressive, country dark. The tower itself was a local landmark, a needle of red beacons piercing the night sky, but the land surrounding it was desolate, a place people didn't go without a reason. He held the slip in his hand, the paper feeling strangely heavy, and considered for a moment asking one of the younger drivers to take it. But the memory of his dwindling bank balance, a specter that haunted every quiet moment, was a more powerful motivator than any vague apprehension. He tucked the slip into his shirt pocket, the address burning a hole against his chest. The city streets slid past his windows, a familiar tapestry of lit porches and glowing storefronts that gradually thinned as he drove. The comforting hum of urban life faded, replaced by the lonely whisper of the wind against his car. He turned onto Peach Street, and the world outside transformed. The neatly trimmed lawns and sidewalks dissolved into ragged fields choked with Queen Anne's lace and thistle. The houses grew farther apart, their windows dark, until they disappeared altogether, leaving only the occasional derelict barn or fenced-off plot of land warning of trespassers. His headlights cut twin cones through the deepening twilight, illuminating the cracked asphalt that seemed to stretch into nothingness. The only constant was the tower, its red eyes blinking rhythmically in the distance, growing larger and more imposing with every mile. His mind, left alone with the monotonous thrum of the engine, drifted back to his financial worries. The math was simple and brutal, a series of subtraction problems that never ended well. The transmission in his car had been groaning for weeks. A repair would cost more than he could make in a month of deliveries. The final notice from the electric company was still sitting on his kitchen table, a white rectangle of pure dread. This delivery, with its potential for a large tip from a remote customer, felt like a small, desperate gamble. He was a man accustomed to navigating by the dim light of worst-case scenarios, and this trip, for all its isolation, was just another calculated risk in a life defined by them. The paved road gave way to gravel, the crunch of stones under his tires a loud, jarring sound in the silence. He passed a rusted mailbox, its number barely legible, and turned onto an even narrower track that was little more than twin ruts in the grass. Weeds scraped against the undercarriage of his car. He was deep in the sticks now, completely alone. The transmission tower loomed directly overhead, a monstrous erector set of steel girders that cast long, cage-like shadows in the beams of his headlights. He slowed the car to a crawl, his eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of a house, a light, a person. There was nothing but the high whine of cicadas and the vast, indifferent sky. A cold knot of certainty formed in his gut. This was not a place for delivering pizza. This was a place for things to go wrong. The car rolled to a stop on the patch of hard-packed dirt that served as a makeshift clearing, the engine's final shudder leaving behind a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. Brian sat for a long moment, hands still gripping the steering wheel, his gaze sweeping the desolate scene. The pizzas sat on the passenger seat, their warmth a small, absurd comfort against the encroaching chill of the evening. The transmission tower stood as a silent, steel sentinel, its latticework a black web against the bruised purple of the twilight sky. There were no buildings in sight, no cars, no signs of life beyond the swaying heads of tall grass in the faint breeze. He checked the delivery slip again, the numbers and street name offering no explanation for the profound emptiness before him. A prickle of pure, animal fear traced a path down his spine. This was wrong. This was profoundly, dangerously wrong. He had just decided to call the shop to question the order, when movement flickered at the edge of his vision. From behind a thicket of scrub oak to his left, a figure emerged. Then another from the right, and a third from the shadow of a rusted machinery shed he hadn't even noticed. They moved with a purpose that was entirely at odds with the randomness of the landscape, converging on his car not like lost customers, but like hunters closing in on a trap. They were upon him before he could even process the threat, surrounding the vehicle. A tall man with a grim, set jaw yanked open the driver's side door, the interior light flooding on to illuminate Brian's face, pale and stunned. Rough hands seized him, pulling him from the car with a force that knocked the air from his lungs. He stumbled on the uneven ground, his pizza delivery uniform a ridiculous costume in the midst of this sudden violence. He was shoved forward, his mind a frantic scramble of confusion and terror. These weren't robbers after the meager cash in his pocket or the pizzas. Their focus was entirely, terrifyingly on him. He tried to speak, to ask what they wanted, but the words came out as a choked gasp. One of them, a woman with sharp, calculating eyes, patted him down with impersonal efficiency, her hands quick and sure. He looked from one face to another, searching for a hint of reason, a flicker of recognizable humanity. He saw only hard masks of determination, a shared intensity that excluded him completely. This was not a random mugging. This was planned. The remote location, the specific order, his own predictable route, it had all been a setup, and he was the perfect disposable pawn. A cold dread, far deeper than the fear of a beating or theft, began to seep into him. He was a man who understood small-scale troubles, financial pinches, and minor deceptions. This was something else entirely, a scenario from a nightmare he couldn't have imagined. He started to babble, his voice trembling, offering them the money from his wallet, the pizzas, his car, anything to break the terrifying spell and return to the world of manageable problems he understood. But his pleas were met with silence or with brusque commands to shut up and cooperate. They were not interested in negotiation. They had a script, and he was being forced to play his part. The cold dread that had been seeping into Brian's veins turned to pure, crystallizing horror as one of the men produced a heavy, metallic object from a duffel bag. It was a collar, thick and industrial, a brutalist piece of machinery that looked like something from a factory floor or a dog kennel, not a weapon. Before he could even process its purpose, they had forced him to his knees in the dirt. The tall man held him from behind, an arm like an iron bar across his chest, while the woman with the sharp eyes stepped forward, the collar held in both hands. Brian struggled instinctively, a surge of panic giving him a fleeting strength, but it was useless against their numbers and their grim resolve. The cold, unyielding metal was clamped around his neck, the latch clicking shut with a finality that echoed in the silence of the field. The weight of it was immediate and shocking, pulling his head forward, a constant physical reminder of his captivity. The woman stepped back, her expression unreadable, and delivered the words that dismantled the last of Brian's reality. It was a bomb, she explained, her voice flat and instructional, as if she were explaining the features of a new appliance. A complex device packed with explosives and shotgun shells, rigged to a timer. There was no room for argument, no space for disbelief in the face of such a concrete physical threat. The weight on his neck was the proof. His hands, trembling violently, rose of their own accord, his fingers brushing against the cold steel, tracing the seams and the protruding ends of the shells. He could feel the faint, sinister hum of the electronics within, a vibration that seemed to resonate deep in his bones. This was not a bluff. The isolation, the planning, the cold efficiency of his captors, it all pointed to a terrible, undeniable truth. The instructions came next, a bizarre and terrifying scavenger hunt laid out with chilling precision. He was to drive to a specific bank downtown. He was to rob it. The demand was for $250,000. The sheer, impossible amount made his head spin. He was to be given a note to hand to the teller, a crudely fashioned cane that was to be presented as a weapon, and a series of clues that would lead him to keys. These keys, they assured him, would unlock the collar. His mind fractured under the onslaught, splitting into two warring halves. One screamed that this was insanity, a sick joke that had gone too far, that the collar couldn't possibly be real. The other, more primal part, listened to the steady, quiet ticking that seemed to emanate from the device and understood, with a cold, sinking certainty, that it was all terrifyingly real. His internal conflict played out on his face, a silent battle between disbelief and the raw, animal fear of imminent death. He looked at their faces, searching for a crack in their facade, a hint of mercy or hesitation. He found none. They were waiting for his answer, their patience a thin, brittle thing. The weight on his neck was the ultimate persuader. To disagree was to die, right here, in this forgotten field under the blinking red eyes of the tower. To agree was to step into a nightmare, to become the very thing he had always feared. A criminal, a spectacle, a pawn in a game he didn't understand. But it was a game that offered a thread of survival, however slim. A chance, however remote, to get the keys, to remove this monstrous thing from his body to live. His shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of him, replaced by a hollow, nauseating resignation. He nodded, the movement awkward and stiff under the collar's weight. He would do it. He would play their game. He would cling to the desperate, fragile hope that it was all an elaborate bluff, even as every instinct told him the bomb was real. The timer was counting down, and his ordinary life was already over. The drive back into the city was a journey through a world that had fundamentally, irrevocably shifted. The familiar streets were the same, but Brian Wells was not. The heavy, cold weight of the collar was a constant, brutal anchor to his new reality, a reality where the hum of his car's engine was underscored by a quieter, more sinister ticking from the device locked around his neck. He had pulled on a faded Guess t-shirt from the backseat, the cheap cotton doing little to conceal the bulky, metallic outline beneath. Every glance in the rearview mirror was a fresh jolt of terror, his own wide, haunted eyes staring back from a face that seemed to belong to a stranger. He drove with a robotic precision, his hands clenched on the wheel, following the instructions burned into his memory. The bank, the note, the money, the keys. It was a mantra of survival, a narrow, desperate path through the chaos. He pulled into the bank's parking lot, the summer sun glinting off the windshields of ordinary cars belonging to ordinary people living ordinary lives. For a moment, he simply sat there, the engine running, watching them come and go. A mother shepherding her children, an elderly couple walking slowly arm in arm, a businessman talking on a cell phone. They were ghosts from a world he had just been forcibly ejected from. The cane they had given him, a crude, intimidating prop, lay on the passenger seat next to the typed note that spelled out his doom. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the air catching in his throat. There was no other choice. The alternative was a violent end in a field, forgotten end. Alone, he killed the engine, the silence that followed feeling more threatening than any noise. Inside, the bank was cool and brightly lit, a temple of orderly commerce. The air smelled of lemon-scented cleaner and old paper. The tellers moved behind their counters with practiced efficiency, and the low murmur of conversations and the clacking of keyboards created a soothing, mundane soundtrack. Brian felt like an imposter, a monster who had wandered into a peaceful dream. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat that he was sure everyone could hear. He approached a young teller, a woman with kind eyes, her station decorated with a small, potted plant. His movements were stiff, unnatural. He did not speak. Instead, he slid the folded note and the cane across the smooth, polished counter. The teller's smile faltered as she read the words. Her face drained of color, her eyes darting from the note to the cane, then to Brian's face, to the unnatural bulk beneath his shirt. He saw the exact moment she understood the threat, the moment her ordinary Tuesday shattered just as his had. Her hands trembled as she read the warning about the bomb, the demand for $250,000. She looked at him not with anger, but with a pure, unadulterated fear that mirrored his own. He stood perfectly still, a statue of forced calm, while inside, a storm of panic raged. He could feel the eyes of other customers, the security guard near the door. Every second stretched into an eternity, measured by the phantom ticking in his ears. The teller fumbled with her drawer, her movements clumsy with terror. She began pulling out stacks of bills, her voice a thin, reedy whisper as she counted. He watched, his stomach clenching into a tighter and tighter knot. The stacks were small, too small. She pushed the meager pile across the counter, a pathetic collection of 20s, 50s, and hundreds. It was nothing close to the demanded amount. It was a pittance, a sickeningly small sum for the monumental risk. 8,700 and some odd dollars. The number echoed in his hollowed-out mind. It was not enough. It would never be enough. This was failure, and failure, according to the rules of this new, terrible game, meant death. He scooped the money into the bag she provided, his movements mechanical. He turned and walked away, leaving the terrified teller and the stunned silence of the bank behind him. The bright sunlight outside was blinding, a cruel mockery of the darkness that now enveloped him. As he reached his car, his hand went to his pocket and emerged with a lollipop, its garish, cellophane wrapper crinkling in the quiet. He unwrapped it with trembling fingers and placed it in his mouth. The cheap, sugary cherry flavor was a bizarre, pointless anchor to a normality that no longer existed. The gesture was one of forced, almost psychotic calm, a pathetic attempt to project an air of control he did not feel. Behind the candy's false sweetness, his mind was screaming, trapped in a cage of metal and fear, hurtling toward an inevitable, violent end with a bag of insufficient cash and a countdown he could not stop. The lollipop was a dry, tasteless stick in his mouth, its sugary promise a hollow lie. Brian drove with a frantic, jerky urgency, the stolen money a paltry weight on the passenger seat, a constant, mocking reminder of his failure. The instructions, seared into his memory, had pointed him here, to this mundane McDonald's parking lot, a place of happy meals and family outings that now felt like a stage for his own execution. He scanned the sun-bleached asphalt, his eyes darting from the bright red and yellow signage to the dumpsters, the hedges, any possible hiding spot for the next clue, the next key, the next fragile thread of hope. The collar felt heavier than ever, a monstrous parasite feeding on his terror, its ticking now a phantom drumbeat syncopating with his own frantic heart. He was so close, yet the world had begun to narrow to the single, desperate objective. Find the clue, get the key live. He never saw the police cars arrive. One moment he was a man alone in a parking lot, a bizarre figure in a guess shirt with a bomb around his neck, and the next, the world erupted in a symphony of sirens and screeching tires. Cruisers boxed him in, their doors flying open to disgorge a small army of officers in tactical vests, their faces set in hard, professional masks. Their shouts were a chaotic blur of sound, commands to show his hands, to get on the ground, that blended into the white noise roar of his own panic. This was it. The interruption, the delay, it was a death sentence. He fumbled with the door handle, stumbling out onto the hot pavement, his hands raised in a gesture of pathetic surrender. Strong hands seized him, forcing him down. The rough asphalt scraped his palms and knees. The weight of the collar slammed against the ground, a brutal, metallic kiss that sent a fresh wave of terror through him. He was pinned, a knee in his back, his wrists being wrenched behind him. The cold click of the handcuffs was a sound of absolute finality, but it was the wrong kind of finality. This was the end of the road, but not the end of the bomb. He twisted his head, his cheek pressed against the grimy ground, and his eyes found the polished black boots of a police sergeant standing over him. The words tore from his throat, raw and desperate, a torrent of pleas that tumbled over one another. He begged them to listen, his voice cracking with a hysteria he could no longer contain. He told them about the bomb, the real bomb, the scavenger hunt, the keys. He babbled about the men in the field, the transmission tower, the insufficient money. He was not a robber, he was a victim, a pawn in a game he never wanted to play. His words were met with a wall of professional skepticism. The officers saw a bank robber, a man with a strange, bulky device around his neck that could, for all they knew, be a hoax, a prop to garner sympathy or complicate his arrest. They saw the desperation of a cornered criminal, not the terror of a condemned man. One officer, younger than the others, peered at the collar with a clinical curiosity, his head tilted. Brian locked eyes with him, pouring every ounce of his crumbling sanity into that gaze. He wasn't lying. The fear was real. The bomb was real. The ticking wasn't in his head. It was in the steel locked to his body. He pleaded for them to let him continue, to let him find the next clue, to let him try to save his own life. He was so close. The McDonald's, the next location. It was all right here. But his frantic explanations were just noise to them, the ramblings of a man trying to escape custody. They were securing a scene, controlling a suspect, following a protocol designed for bank robbers, not for participants in a live-action, lethal puzzle. They began to pull him to his feet, preparing to move him, to process him, to slot him into the cold, efficient machinery of the justice system. And as they did, Brian's pleas dissolved into a wordless, guttural moan of pure despair. They were saving him from the law, but they were delivering him to the bomb. The first change was a subtle shift in the rhythm, a quickening of the electronic pulse that had been a constant, sinister companion. The steady, metronomic beep that had underscored Brian's terror for the last hour suddenly stuttered, then accelerated into a frantic, high-pitched chirping. It was the sound of a dying bird, a digital scream that cut through the murmur of police radios and the stern commands of the officers. The sound seemed to originate not from the air around them, but from the very core of Brian's being, a malignant heartbeat that was now racing toward its final, violent contraction. For Brian, the world narrowed to that sound. The feel of the rough asphalt beneath his knees, the grip of the officer's hands on his arms, the confused and wary faces of the police encircling him, it all dissolved into a blur. The chirping was the only reality, a countdown he could feel vibrating through the metal against his throat. A primal, electric jolt of adrenaline surged through him, overriding the numbness of his shock. He tried to lurch forward, a clumsy, shackled movement, his body screaming at him to run, to put distance between himself and the device, to obey the most basic instinct of all. A guttural, wordless cry ripped from his throat, a sound of pure, animal terror that was utterly divorced from the desperate, reasoned pleas of moments before. He managed to shuffle maybe a foot, a pathetic, hobbled attempt at escape that was cut short by the firm hands holding him. The officers, finally grasping that this was not a hoax, that the desperation in his eyes was a reflection of a very real and imminent threat, began to shout, their own professional calm fracturing. "Bomb! Get back!" The circle around him broke as they scrambled away, their self-preservation kicking in. For one crystalline second, Brian was alone in the center of that expanding ring, on his knees in the fast food parking lot, a man utterly and completely isolated in the face of his own annihilation. Then the world turned white. The sound was not an explosion as one imagines it from movies, a loud, singular boom. It was a deafening, percussive crack thump that seemed to suck all other sound from the universe before violently replacing it. It was the sound of metal tearing, of physics being brutally rewritten. A flash of incandescent orange and yellow bloomed from his chest, a terrible, brief sun that consumed the space where he knelt. When the light and sound receded, what was left was a scene of grotesque stillness. Brian's body was thrown backward, a broken doll tossed aside by an indifferent hand. He lay sprawled on the asphalt, a dark, spreading pool already seeping out from beneath him. The center of his torso was a ruin, the bomb collar, a masterpiece of malicious engineering, had directed its force inward. A cavernous, jagged hole was torn through his chest, a void where his sternum and ribs had been. The edges of the wound were blackened and smoldering, the raw, red tissue within a stark, anatomical horror against the pale skin of his abdomen. The force had been so concentrated, so precise, that it had scooped him out, leaving a graphic, hollow testament to the power that had been locked around his neck. His guest t-shirt was shredded, the fabric fused to the seared flesh at the wound's perimeter. The police and bystanders who had been scrambling for cover now stood frozen, their hands still raised to shield their faces, their mouths agape in a uniform mask of shock. The air, which had been filled with shouting and the frantic chirping, was now preternaturally silent, broken only by the faint crackle of something burning and the drip of fluid onto the pavement. The smell was acrid and thick, cordite, burnt meat, and the coppery tang of blood. One of the younger officers turned away abruptly, his body convulsing as he vomited onto the asphalt. Another simply stared, his face a pale, bloodless canvas of disbelief. They had been prepared for a bank robber, a suspect, a problem to be solved. They were not prepared for this raw, public evisceration, for the sudden, brutal transition from an arrest to a slaughter. Brian Wells was no longer a man or even a victim. He was a crime scene, a tragedy made flesh, a stark and bloody lesson in the terrifying inevitability of a clock that had run out. The parking lot, once a stage for a frantic arrest, had hardened into a tableau of grim, methodical investigation. The air still carried the ghost of the explosion, a lingering scent of ozone, scorched metal, and something faintly sweet and coppery that the afternoon breeze couldn't quite dispel. Yellow police tape formed a wide, fluttering perimeter, cordoning off the epicenter of the violence, a dark, stained patch of asphalt that seemed to absorb the sunlight. Within that circle, forensic technicians moved with a quiet, deliberate purpose, their white-suited forms bending and straightening like surgeons in a ruined operating theater. They collected fragments, shards of twisted metal from the collar, scorched pieces of wiring, and other unidentifiable carbonized bits, placing each item into separate evidence bags with gloved, reverent hands. The scene was a brutal puzzle, and every speck of debris was a potential clue. The focus soon shifted to Brian's car, parked a short, tragic distance away. It sat where he had left it, a dusty, unremarkable sedan that now held the secrets to his final, desperate hour. Detectives, their faces etched with a mixture of professional detachment and profound unease, opened the doors. The interior was a capsule of a life interrupted, a half-eaten lollipop, its stick still clean, rested in the cup holder. The faint, greasy smell of pepperoni clung to the upholstery, and on the passenger seat, partially tucked under the stack of delivery slips, was a small, spiral-bound notepad. The lead detective, a man named Holloway with weary eyes and a permanent 5 o'clock shadow, picked it up with the tips of his fingers. The pages were filled with a frantic, slanted handwriting, a chaotic stream of consciousness that documented the rules of the deadly game. There were driving times calculated with obsessive precision: 14 minutes from the tower to the bank, 7 from the bank to the McDonald's. There were notes on the clues, cryptic phrases that made little sense out of context. And most chillingly, there were warnings, underlined multiple times. Do not pull on collar, and bomb will detonate if tampered with. The notes were not the plans of a conspirator. They were the terrified memorizations of a man trying to save his own life, a script forced upon him. Holloway felt a cold anger settle in his gut. This was not a robbery gone wrong. It was a meticulously planned execution disguised as a heist. Acting on the directions scrawled in the notepad, a separate team was dispatched to the second location, a secluded spot near a dirt bike trail not far from the initial ambush site. The instructions had described a specific geocache-style container, a painted ammo can hidden at the base of a particular tree, which was supposed to hold the next clue and a key. But when the officers arrived, sweeping the area with flashlights that cut beams through the gathering dusk, they found nothing. The ground at the base of the tree was disturbed, the leaf litter scraped away in a fresh, raw patch, but the container was gone. There were no footprints, no tire tracks beyond their own, no discarded cigarette butts, nothing. It was a void, a negative space in the evidence that spoke volumes. Someone had been here. Someone had cleaned the scene, removing a critical piece of the puzzle with a cool, calculated efficiency that left the investigators with nothing but the ghost of an action. Back at the station, the evidence was laid out on a long table under the harsh fluorescent lights. The notepad, the bomb fragments, the photos of the empty hiding spot. The detectives stood around it, a silent council surveying the components of a unique and terrifying malice. They began to build a profile, not of a typical criminal, but of a bomb maker. This was not a weapon of passion or rage. It was a device of intricate, cold-blooded design. The use of a scavenger hunt, the reliance on precise timing, the remote control potential suggested an intelligence, a mind that enjoyed puzzles and complex systems. The reclusive nature of the locations, the lack of any witnesses, the clean removal of evidence pointed to someone who was patient, meticulous, and deeply antisocial. This was not someone who sought the spotlight of a typical crime. This was a spider, they concluded, a creature who had built a perfect, deadly web in the shadows and had now retreated back into them, leaving only the shredded remains of a pizza delivery man as proof of its existence. The hunt was no longer for a robber. It was for an architect of death. The aftermath of the explosion settled into a grim, procedural quiet, the initial chaos giving way to the meticulous work of reconstruction. The parking lot became a grid of numbered markers and measured strings, a clinical overlay imposed upon a scene of visceral horror. Every fragment of the detonated collar was photographed, catalogued, and bagged, each piece a silent witness to the sophisticated malice that had designed it. The bomb squad technicians, their faces grim behind their protective gear, spoke in low, respectful tones about the device's complexity. The precise arrangement of the shotgun shells, the cleverly routed wiring, the timer that was both a psychological weapon and a guarantee of the outcome. It was not a crude, improvised device. It was a crafted instrument, the work of someone who understood both explosives and human terror. The focus of the investigation, however, began to pivot from the site of Brian's death to the places he had been forced to go. His car, impounded and sealed, yielded its most critical clue not in the form of a weapon or a fingerprint, but in a small, spiral-bound notepad found tucked under the driver's seat. The pages were filled with a frantic, slanted script, a desperate transcription of the rules of the deadly game. There were driving times calculated to the minute, cryptic instructions for the scavenger hunt, and chilling, underlined warnings. Do not pull on collar and bomb will detonate if tampered with. The handwriting was Brian's, but the words were not his own. They were a dictated script for his own execution. The notes painted a picture of a mind that was both brilliantly organized and deeply cruel. Someone who derived satisfaction from constructing an elaborate, inescapable trap. Acting on the directions scrawled in the notepad, a team of detectives was dispatched to the second location, a secluded spot near a dirt bike trail where a clue container was supposed to be hidden. They arrived as the sun dipped below the tree line, casting long, skeletal shadows across the forest floor. The coordinates led them to the base of a specific pine tree, its bark scarred and weathered. But the ground there told a story of recent, furtive activity. The leaf litter was scraped away in a raw, fresh patch, the earth beneath disturbed and soft. The painted ammo described in Brian's notes was gone. There were no clear footprints, no discarded items, nothing but the void where evidence should have been. Someone had been here, someone who knew the game's timeline intimately, and had arrived to sanitize the trail, removing a critical link in the chain with a cool, dispassionate efficiency that left the investigators staring at an empty hole in the ground. Back at the command center, the profile of the bomb maker began to solidify. This was not an act of impulsive violence. It was a performance. The use of a scavenger hunt, the reliance on precise timing and remote locations, the clean removal of the clue container, it all pointed to an individual of high intelligence, meticulous planning, and a profound emotional detachment. This was a person who operated from the shadows, who viewed human life as a variable in a complex equation. They were hunting a spider, a patient, reclusive architect who had woven a web of metal and fear, and then retreated, leaving only the shredded remains of an ordinary man and the ghost of a plan that was, for now, still perfectly hidden. Weeks had bled into a tense, frustrating month, the initial shock of the collar bomb murder hardening into a cold case that seemed to have no viable leads. The profile of the intelligent, reclusive bomb maker remained, but it was a ghost without a name, a silhouette without a face. Then the quiet was shattered by a phone call that seemed to come from a different, more sordid world entirely. The caller identified himself as William, his voice a thin, reedy thread of panic. He reported a dead body, he said, stored in the freezer of his own home. But the confession was immediately followed by a frantic deflection. The body was not his doing, he insisted. It was his ex-girlfriend, Marjorie. She was the one, he claimed, who was responsible for everything. Police cars descended upon the small, cluttered house, their flashing lights painting the quiet neighborhood in pulses of urgent blue and red. The air inside was thick with the smell of stale food and damp decay. In the garage, the freezer stood like a grim altar. When the lid was pried open, the frigid metallic air that poured out carried the unmistakable scent of death. Inside, wrapped in a blood-stained sheet, was the body of a man, frozen solid. But the horror in the freezer was only the beginning of the story this house had to tell. The search of the property revealed a trove of bizarre and incriminating evidence. The basement was a chaotic workshop, a graveyard of scavenged machinery. Piles of junk metal were stacked haphazardly, scraps of sheet steel, lengths of heavy-duty pipe, and intricate clockwork mechanisms that bore a disturbing resemblance to the components of the bomb collar. It was the workshop of a tinkerer, a hoarder of parts, someone who saw potential in discarded things. And tucked away in a kitchen drawer beneath a jumble of loose batteries and take-out menus was a single, handwritten note. Its message was simple and direct. I had nothing to do with the collar bomb. It was a denial of a crime no one had yet publicly connected to him, a preemptive protest of innocence that was more damning than any confession. The pieces, once scattered and meaningless, began to click into a terrifying new picture. William and his ex-girlfriend Marjorie were not ordinary suspects. They were known to be intelligent, reclusive, and shared a background in engineering and fabrication. Their isolation from the community, their strange, hoarding habits, and their volatile relationship now took on a sinister new context. The junk metal in the basement was no longer just junk. It was the raw material for a weapon. Their knowledge was no longer just a curious fact. It was the expertise required to build a sophisticated explosive device. The call about the body in the freezer was not just a report of a separate crime. It was the frantic act of a man trying to control a narrative that was spiraling out of his control, a desperate attempt to point the finger elsewhere as the walls of his own making began to close in. The spider, it seemed, had not retreated into the shadows after all. He had been living in a cluttered house on an ordinary street, and his web was far more extensive than anyone had dared to imagine. The truth, when it finally emerged, did not come from an interrogation room under bright lights, but from the foul, shadowed corners of the county jail. Marjorie, stripped of the strange, calculating intensity that had defined her, now existed in a state of squalor, her orange jumpsuit hanging loose on a frame grown thin from neglect and fear. The reclusive intelligence that had once designed intricate mechanisms had curdled into a desperate need to confess, to share the weight of the horror she had helped engineer. Her audience was not the police, but her cellmates, women whose own crimes seemed petty and impulsive in the face of her cold, premeditated evil. In the dead hours of the night, her voice a low, monotone whisper, she began to unravel the conspiracy, painting a picture of such profound deception that it seemed to suck the very air from the cramped space. She spoke of William, not with affection but as a co-conspirator, a partner in a shared delusion of grandeur and revenge. Together, in the cluttered, junk-filled basement that had become their laboratory, they had designed the collar. It was her mind that had plotted the circuitry, the precise angles of the shotgun shells, the psychological torment of the timer. It was William's hands that had assembled the scavenged metal, welding the steel bands and fitting the locks. The device was not just a bomb, it was their masterpiece, a perverse work of art designed for a single, brutal performance. And Brian Wells, the pizza delivery man, was not a willing accomplice or a fall guy. He was a pawn, selected for his vulnerability, his ordinariness, his complete and utter expendability. He had been lured to the tower with the promise of a simple delivery, ambushed and fitted with the instrument of his own death, all while believing the fantastical story of a bank robbery and a scavenger hunt for keys. The true motive, she confessed with a chilling lack of emotion, was layered in a web of lies. The bank robbery was never about the money, not really. The $250,000 demand was a fiction, a number chosen for its audacity, a red herring to make. The charade seemed believable. The real goal was to acquire a smaller, more manageable sum, seed money to fund a different murder entirely. Marjorie wanted her father dead. The paltry $8,700 Brian had procured was intended to be the down payment for a hitman, a final, violent severance from a lifetime of perceived grievances. And the most damning part of the plan, the detail that revealed the absolute depths of their deceit, was the timer itself. They had never intended for Brian to succeed. The bomb was designed to detonate before he could possibly complete the scavenger hunt. He was not just a robber. He was a walking dead man, a fall guy whose violent, public death was meant to draw all the investigative attention, leaving William and Marjorie shrouded in the chaos, free to pursue their true objective with their grisly startup capital. The full, sordid picture was confirmed by another voice from the periphery of the plot. A man named Kenneth, whose role had been smaller, but whose knowledge was just as damning. He laid out the plan with the dispassionate clarity of someone recounting a business proposal, confirming that Brian had been an unwitting dupe, tricked into wearing the device with the false promise of survival. The entire elaborate production, the notes, the clues, the cane, was stage dressing for a snuff film in which the victim was both the star and the intended patsy. The thematic threads of the tragedy were now pulled taut. The vulnerability of the mundane exploited by calculated evil, the devastating power of deception, and the hollow, twisted form of justice that eventually found its way to the conspirators. Marjorie and William were arrested, their fates sealed not by a successful robbery, but by the grotesque failure of their own over-engineered plot. They would both eventually die in prison, their lives ending in the same kind of confined, squalid isolation in which their scheme had been born, a bleak and fitting closure to a story that began with a pizza delivery and ended in a symphony of lies and metal, leaving a city to forever wonder at the darkness that could fester in plain sight.